Breaking news. Massive financial scandal under federal review. What? Investigators examine major banking irregularities tied to a $2 billion.
Committed on the grand stage of the NBA. But we also
Cartel infiltration shatters suburban America. What happens when the quietest neighborhood in America becomes the front line of a cartel war no one knew had already begun? Before sunrise, as soft light barely touched the treetops of suburban Georgia, federal monitors flagged something no resident could see: a convergence of corrupted police officers, a banker with cartel ties, and millions in drug money positioned inside a trusted institution. It was the kind of betrayal that doesn't just break laws, it breaks the illusion that American communities are safe. And at 5:04 a.m., that illusion shattered. The synchronized movement of FBI and ICE agents sliced through the pre-dawn calm like a scalpel through fabric. Engines idled, radios clicked, then the breach teams moved silently and with purpose toward the $1.8 million home of Daniel K. Hawthorne, a respected bank director whose public image masked a far darker allegiance. Inside the house, agents discovered 14 firearms, heroin, and methamphetamine hidden beneath the floorboards, and an encrypted drive linking Hawthorne directly to La Furia Roja, a cartel already tied to thousands of violent and drug-related crimes across the United States. Simultaneously, the second federal team hit Georgia Prime Bank's 11th floor. Surveillance cameras had been cut, lights dimmed, and Hawthorne stood inside with 3 Georgia police officers, men entrusted with community safety, beside duffel bags stuffed with $62 million in color-coded cash. In that muted room, the truth became undeniable. A trusted banker had become a financial architect for one of America's most violent transnational cartels. The scene was cinematic, but the stakes were brutally real. What investigators uncovered in that moment was not a lone criminal, but a structural breach, a cartel using American systems, American institutions, even American officers to expand its reach. The discovery forced a grim reckoning. If corruption could penetrate a bank director's office and local police, what else had already been compromised? The answer emerged quickly. Claudia Varela Hawthorne's wife appeared repeatedly in recovered documents and encrypted messages. The federal profile described her as polite, calm, almost shy, but behind that softness was the lineage of a founding commander of La Furia Roja, a gang born from hardened fugitives across Venezuela, Colombia, and Mexico. These were men shaped by riot-scarred prisons, border gunfights, and decades of drug war brutality. It was Claudia who led Daniel into the cartel's orbit, transforming him from a banker into a financial weapon. By the time agents finished combing through both raid sites, the breakthrough had snowballed. Hawthorne wasn't just laundering money, he was coordinating transfers, arranging pickups, and bribing officials across multiple counties. Investigators found links to 23 county employees, 5 senior police officers, and nearly $10 million in disguised payments, all forming a quiet lattice of corruption that had allowed La Furia Roja to spread far beyond the shadows. For a nation already balancing security, freedom, and the weight of global instability in 2025, this discovery struck a painful nerve. If a cartel could nest itself inside suburban Georgia, inside local governments, inside police departments, how many more communities were already compromised, and how many Americans were living their daily lives unaware of the danger hiding behind familiar faces? The banker, the wife, and the cartel machine. The deeper investigators dug into Daniel Hawthorne's life, the clearer it became that the man standing in that dim 11th floor bank office was not a recent recruit or a reluctant accomplice. He was a carefully placed asset, groomed, guided, and weaponized by someone far more experienced in the anatomy of organized crime. And that someone was the woman the public had always seen as gentle, polite, reserved Claudia Varela. What federal agents unraveled next revealed that her calm demeanor concealed a lineage carved from violence. Claudia was the daughter of a founding commander of La Furia Roja, a cartel forged inside the chaos of Venezuelan, Colombian, and Mexican prison uprisings. Its earliest members were escapees, men hardened by torture and border gunfights, men whose survival instincts had been sharpened into something almost militaristic. Over 8 years, the gang transformed from a loose band of fugitives into a 2,000-member insurgent-style organization, responsible for more than 600 violent and drug-related crimes across 17 U.S. states. Their reputation was clear, ruthless, mobile, and willing to execute anyone police officer, rival, trafficker, or civilian who obstructed their expansion. What investigators discovered was that Claudia had not simply married into an American life. She had integrated a cartel strategy into it. Daniel's downward transformation followed a precise pattern seen in infiltration operations across Latin America. Recruit the insider, legitimize the front, and build the pipeline. At first, Daniel's actions were nearly invisible. Quiet account manipulation, small irregularities buried in routine transactions, safe deposit boxes opened after hours. But as greed seeped in, his responsibilities multiplied. He authorized hidden wire transfers labeled as corporate investments. He approved cash pickups at times when only trusted bank staff were present. He facilitated movements of funds that strengthened La Furia Roja's foothold in the US financial system. Then the evidence grew darker. Encrypted messages recovered from Hawthorne's drives revealed Daniel negotiating bribes with public officials, subtle at first, then brazen. What emerged was a bribery network spanning 23 county employees and 5 senior police officers with $9.6 million in illicit payments disguised as consulting fees, equipment upgrades, or community programs. Officials who once swore oaths to protect their counties were now moving in sync with cartel logistics. The operation was no longer about cash, it was about access, clearances, cover, time. Every discovery pointed to the same conclusion: Claudia had not married into America to escape violence. She had married into a strategic position, and Daniel, blinded by ambition and greed, became the perfect American bridge for a cartel seeking legitimacy. Federal analysts reviewing the case described the marriage as a partnership built on blood money and strategic influence. It was clear that Daniel wasn't simply corrupted, he had been converted, and with every account he altered, every transfer he approved, and every official he bribed, La Furia Roja expanded its reach deeper into American structures. By the time federal agents pieced together the timeline, the scope of Hawthorne's betrayal was staggering. A banker praised for his professionalism had quietly become one of the cartel's most valuable assets, not because he carried a gun, but because he carried authority. His decisions allowed a foreign-born criminal empire to embed itself into the everyday routines of American life. But the most shocking realization came from what investigators described as the invisible scaffolding, a web of financial and institutional influence that touched far more than banks. It reached into county offices, school systems, transportation networks, and local enforcement channels. And it all began with a marriage that blended suburban respectability with cartel ambition. As the truth settled, the question grew sharper. If one couple could corrupt this many systems, how many more communities across America were already living with similar hidden fractures? And if a cartel could quietly turn a banker into a strategic asset, how many trusted figures were still operating undetected? Operation Hawthorne ignites nationwide raids. The moment federal analysts connected Daniel Hawthorne's financial networks to La Furia Roja's national operations urgency replaced speculation. The threat was no longer theoretical, it was active, spreading, and deeply embedded. And with President Donald Trump demanding a full-spectrum crackdown on cartel infiltration inside U.S. institutions, the order came swiftly, a directive that would reshape the national security landscape before sunrise. At 4:27 a.m. on November 20th, 2025, the command flashed across encrypted federal channels: initiate full interdiction. All units execute. In seconds, rotors spun lights snapped on engines, roared awake across 7 states. More than 2,500 federal agents from the FBI, ICE, DEA, HSI, ATF, and the U.S. Marshals Service deployed simultaneously. The operation's scale evoked the early 2000s counterterrorism sweeps, but this time, the enemy wasn't foreign militants. It was a cartel that had learned to weaponize American systems from the inside. Northern Georgia became the first flashpoint. Fog rolled across open fields as tactical teams advanced with night vision goggles casting eerie green reflections off their gear. Inside the first target house cartel, gunmen emerged firing military-style rifles, the muzzle flashes tearing through the darkness. Sparks ricocheted from federal shields as agents pushed forward in a coordinated counter-assault. Within 90 seconds, the firefight was over. 48 kilograms of heroin were seized along with ledgers, burner phones, and encrypted tablets pointing to deeper networks. Hundreds of miles west, Houston erupted next. Armored SUVs swarmed an industrial complex masquerading as a chemical processing facility. In truth, it was one of La Furia Roja's largest conversion labs, where precursors were engineered into crystalline methamphetamine for distribution across the South. As agents raided the warehouse, workers plunged the structure into blackout. Dust, smoke, and chemical fumes filled the air. But overhead, drones switched to thermal mode, marking every figure inside with stark infrared outlines. 31 suspects were apprehended. Barrels of precursor chemicals capable of producing hundreds of pounds of meth lined the walls like silent bombs. Then came the most violent clash, Southern California. At the West Coast distribution docks, cartel convoys scrambled to flee in pickup trucks rigged with hidden stash compartments. Sirens wailed, engines screamed, spike strips shredded tires. One truck rammed a federal vehicle, triggering a rapid flanking maneuver as backup teams sealed off the industrial grid. The chase lasted 14 minutes, ending with the convoy neutralized and several high-ranking cell leaders in custody. By midday, the nation understood the magnitude of Operation Hawthorne. It wasn't a raid, it was a dismantling. Across 7 states, agents arrested 5,180 suspects, seized multiple tons of heroin, meth, and cocaine, and removed $980 million in cash from cartel circulation. Federal cyber teams froze $1,089 billion in cryptocurrency, the digital bloodstream that had allowed La Furia Roja to expand undetected. Hundreds of weapons, AR platform rifles, modified pistols, and imported tactical gear were confiscated. But even as the numbers poured in, a chilling realization grew. The cartel's physical infrastructure had been hit hard, but its most dangerous weapon wasn't firepower, it was infiltration. Many of the seizures, movements, and operations uncovered during the raids aligned suspiciously with official schedules, clearance notes, and emergency waivers issued by public employees. Someone or many someones inside the American system had been keeping the cartel alive. The federal sweep had broken the cartel's outer defenses, but the next stage would prove far more painful, confronting the enemies wearing American uniforms, signing American documents, and holding American authority. And with that knowledge, a new question hovered over every briefing room in Washington. If La Furia Roja had woven itself into the fabric of American institutions, how many more threads of corruption were waiting to be pulled? A network hidden inside American institutions. As the dust settled from the nationwide raids, analysts turned their attention to something far more complex than drug labs, safe houses, or cartel convoys. What emerged from Daniel Hawthorne's encrypted drives was not the anatomy of a gang, it was the blueprint of an infiltration campaign that had quietly threaded itself through the American system for years. The 2.7 terabytes of data recovered from his devices revealed a cartel network operating not around America, but through America. The files contained internal communications, laundering ledgers, shipping notes, port clearance schedules, and most disturbingly, routine email chains that meant nothing in isolation, but everything once tied to the timestamps from the raids. That was when patterns formed. That was when the facade cracked. A county police sergeant in Georgia, long admired for teaching anti-drug workshops in high schools, appeared in message chains coordinating transit windows. Those exact windows matched shipments now confirmed to contain heroin and fentanyl precursors. A procurement officer in Texas had approved 18 emergency import waivers over the past 2 years. On paper, they were routine. In reality, each waiver aligned with cartel cargo routed through ports under federal scrutiny. A Florida medical examiner received payments labeled as clinical review fees, but the financial trail led back to offshore accounts managed by Claudia Varela. The more the data was analyzed, the clearer it became La Furia Roja had infiltrated not only fringe corners of American life, but its most trusted institutions. The cartel wasn't hiding in alleyways and abandoned barns. It was hiding in offices, hospitals, classrooms, transit systems, and churches. And the depth of corruption was staggering. More than 440 individuals across government, healthcare, education, and transportation were tied directly or indirectly to cartel operations. Some offered logistical cover, others provided forged documents, transport clearance, or communication channels. A few appeared to be full-fledged operatives. One entry stunned investigators across the federal task force. A delivery driver employed by a major national shipping company had diverted hundreds of packages to cartel safe houses. The packages now seized contained precursors, encrypted phones, and cash bundles disguised as medical equipment. Another entry was even harder to process. A celebrated middle school teacher in New Jersey had acted as a low-level recruiter, identifying vulnerable students from troubled households. Notes recovered from encrypted chats suggested she had recommended 6 youths to cartel contacts, believing the gang would provide opportunities. Instead, those teenagers vanished into distribution pipelines and trafficking networks. Even religious institutions were compromised. A treasurer at a long-standing Arizona church had quietly funneled cartel donations through youth outreach programs, effectively laundering La Furia Roja's money under the cover of community charity. Across the Carolinas, Cartel operated trucking companies, disguised narcotics shipments as produce deliveries, blending seamlessly with legitimate interstate commerce. Retirees on cross-country road trips unknowingly parked beside vehicles carrying tens of millions in concealed drugs. In Florida, small medical clinics processed fraudulent certifications that helped cartel members avoid detention by appearing medically unfit for incarceration. The map of infiltration grew larger by the hour. What analysts assembled on the Situation Room wall was a nationwide web that stretched from the Pacific docks to the Atlantic suburbs, a lattice of logistics influence and quiet corruption built under the noses of millions of unsuspecting Americans. For older Americans, many of whom had lived through the Cold War, the crack epidemic, post-9/11 terror alerts, and financial crises, this revelation struck a uniquely painful chord. Unlike past threats, there was no border ideology or foreign battlefield to point to. The threat had grown beside them, behind them, around them. The danger was not an invading cartel army. It was the realization that everyday institutions, hospitals, schools, banks, local governments could be weaponized against the nation from within. But the most chilling discovery came in the form of a spreadsheet titled Tier Support. It categorized 4 levels of compromised personnel: street facilitators, municipal employees, law enforcement, and finally financial and political influence. Sitting at the top of Tier 4 was Daniel K. Hawthorne beside 3 county officials and a state-level advisor whose identity remained sealed. In the briefing room, an FBI supervisor summarized the findings with a sentence that would later appear in congressional testimony. This wasn't a cartel exploiting America. This was America's own apparatus repurposed into a cartel asset. If the raids had exposed the cartel's external operations, Hawthorne's files revealed its internal machinery, a machinery built on trust, silence, and institutional familiarity. And as analysts stared at the infiltration map, the unspoken question became impossible to ignore. If La Furia Roja had already spread this far, what other institutions were one step away from collapse? The integrity collapse of U.S. law enforcement. When federal teams finished mapping La Furia Roja's institutional infiltration, the most painful chapter of the investigation began the collapse of integrity within America's own enforcement ranks. What had started as a financial takedown of Daniel K. Hawthorne now revealed a second battlefield, one not fought in warehouses or border convoys, but inside precincts, county offices, and state agencies. And the enemy was no longer armed cartel soldiers. It was Americans wearing badges, holding authority, and sworn to protect the nation. Within just 72 hours, the FBI's internal affairs units and federal corruption task forces initiated what senior officials later described as the most extensive integrity sweep in 4 decades. More than 380 law enforcement personnel across 11 states were flagged for immediate review. The sheer volume stunned Washington. It wasn't just a handful of rogue officers or isolated misconduct. This was systemic, a network of compromised individuals whose actions had directly enabled the cartel's expansion. By the end of the first wave, 187 officers, deputies, and corrections staff were placed under emergency suspension. Over 120 government officials, from procurement clerks to county supervisors, were served with sealed federal indictments. County courts across the South and Southeast ground to halt. Some rural police departments were forced to shut down temporarily due to lack of untainted staff. For communities used to looking at their police stations as symbols of protection, the sight of badges being carried out of precincts and evidence bags was a psychological blow unlike anything in recent memory. The details were worse. A sheriff's lieutenant in Alabama had erased 27 arrest warrants, all linked to cartel couriers traveling through the state. A state trooper in South Carolina provided real-time GPS locations of DUI checkpoints to cartel logistics teams, allowing their drug convoys to reroute safely. A decorated police captain in Georgia, a man months from retirement, had sold escort clearances to cartel trucks for $8,000 a night, shielding narcotics shipments moving across interstate corridors. He had been doing so for nearly 3 years. Then came the confessions, the sealed interviews that shook federal investigators. Some officers claimed they were threatened, describing La Furia Roja's reputation for torture and reprisal. Others admitted outright greed, recounting years of taking cartel money disguised as consulting fees or community program donations. A few insisted they had been framed, but digital trails, messenger logs, account deposits, and encrypted calendars told a different story. Many of the compromised officers had been key cogs in the cartel's infiltration strategy, allowing shipments to move freely, documents to be forged, and raids to be avoided. For older Americans watching the nightly news, the emotional impact was profound. They had lived through periods of domestic turmoil, the political scandals of the 1970s, the crack epidemic of the 1980s, the corruption waves of the early 2000s. But this felt different. This wasn't a scandal of mismanagement or incompetence. It was a revelation that criminals had infiltrated the very institutions entrusted with defending the country, and the betrayal felt personal. Across 6 days, 184 public sector defendants were taken into federal custody. Courtrooms overflowed. Local governments scrambled to stabilize public services. Some cities held emergency town hall meetings just to reassure residents that the system still had enough integrity left to function. In states like Georgia, Texas, and Florida, the shockwaves traveled from small-town neighborhoods to state capitals, prompting widespread calls for reform and federal oversight. Yet amid the chaos, the message from Washington remained unwavering. Operation Hawthorne was not simply about dismantling a cartel, it was about purging corruption, restoring the trust that had been quietly eroded for years. One FBI assistant director stated bluntly, "You cannot secure a nation if criminals are hiding in the uniforms of its guardians." That line would echo across congressional hearings for months. But even as dozens of officials were arrested and hundreds more suspended, the deeper implications remained unresolved. How could a cartel built in foreign prisons infiltrate American law enforcement so thoroughly? How had the red flags been missed? And how many more compromised officials, unseen and unidentified, were still operating undetected? As the integrity sweeps continued, it became clear that the true battlefield wasn't only in the drug corridors or safe houses. It was inside the American system itself, a system in the middle of painful necessary self-correction. And as federal agents prepared to rebuild what corruption had fractured the nation, confronted a question it had avoided for too long: what happens when the threat isn't at the border but already wearing the uniform? America reckons with betrayal and lost trust. When the final signatures dried on federal arrest warrants and the last raid sites were sealed, a deeper truth emerged, one that couldn't be measured in kilos of heroin, seized cash, or frozen cryptocurrency. The real cost of Daniel Hawthorne's corruption was not the drugs he helped move or the officers he helped compromise. It was the erosion of something far more fragile and far more valuable: the trust Americans placed in their institutions. For years, La Furia Roja had not merely infiltrated the United States. It had camouflaged itself within the architecture of American life, behind polished bank counters, inside police precincts, under the fluorescent lights of courtrooms, and beneath the serene quiet of suburban neighborhoods. And it had done so not through brute force, but through manipulation, bribery, silence, and familiarity. It infiltrated in plain sight because communities trusted the very people who were helping the cartel thrive. Families who placed their savings in Georgia Prime Bank had no idea the director they trusted was quietly converting their deposits into cartel assets. Parents who waved at school resource officers each morning never realized some of those officers had knowingly altered patrol schedules to shield drug shipments. Churchgoers who donated to youth outreach programs didn't know their contributions were being diverted through cartel launderers wearing treasurer badges. The betrayal was not abstract, it was intimate. In state after state, the aftermath created a ripple effect that was both visible and invisible. Police departments stripped of dozens of compromised staff found themselves understaffed and overwhelmed. County courts suddenly missing trusted clerks and administrators struggled to process cases. Government offices faced operational paralysis, especially in regions where cartel influence had been strongest. Communities that once prided themselves on stability now grappled with uncertainty, suspicion, and anger. For older Americans, the emotional weight was heavier still. Many had lived through eras defined by clear adversaries, foreign powers, terrorist cells, economic crises. But this was different. The threat had grown inside the institutions they believed were immovable pillars of American life. A banker corrupted, a teacher compromised, a police captain bought, a church treasurer subverted. The cartel had understood something vital. Trust is a currency more powerful than cash, and once stolen, it is harder to recover than any seized asset. Across the country, families began asking a question no nation wants to confront: who can we trust now? It was a question that echoed from Georgia neighborhoods to California ports, from Florida clinics to Texas county offices. The collapse of trust spread faster than the criminal network itself. Even institutions untouched by corruption found themselves under scrutiny, forced to communicate openly, audit aggressively, and rebuild slowly. Yet even amid the grief, something else surfaced resolve. The same communities shaken by betrayal also witnessed the largest domestic anti-cartel operation in a generation, a coordinated federal response that refused to let infiltration become a permanent wound. Operation Hawthorne severed financial arteries, eliminated distribution hubs, arrested key leaders, and dismantled a hidden infrastructure that had taken years to build. And it exposed a truth America needed to face. Corruption does not flourish when criminals attack a nation. It flourishes when good people stop paying attention. The lesson was painful but essential. As rebuilding began, federal officials emphasized that restoring trust would be harder than seizing drugs or arresting compromised officers. Transparency, oversight, and community engagement became national priorities. Congress opened hearings on institutional infiltration. States passed new audit requirements. Local governments launched independent review boards. The work would be slow, the scars would be lasting, but the system, though shaken, was not broken. In the end, the downfall of Daniel Hawthorne and the collapse of La Furia Roja's American network served as both warning and wake-up call. A nation as large and complex as the United States remains strong only when its citizens remain vigilant, its institutions remain transparent, and its guardians remain accountable. So the final question lingers, one America must answer together. If corruption grows quietly where no one is looking, how closely are we willing to watch from now on? And for those who refuse to let this story fade, who want to continue exposing how deep this infiltration went, the next chapter depends on you. Tap like, stay alert, and subscribe to ensure these truths never disappear into silence. Operation Hawthorne revealed one of the most extensive cartel infiltrations in modern U.S. history, beginning with the arrest of Georgia banker Daniel K. Hawthorne and spreading into a nationwide crisis. Federal agents uncovered Hawthorne's deep involvement with La Furia Roja, a brutal militarized cartel responsible for thousands of violent crimes across the United States. His wife, Claudia Varela, the daughter of a cartel commander, played a key role in integrating Hawthorne into the organization's financial architecture. A massive federal interdiction order triggered coordinated raids across 7 states, resulting in over 5,000 arrests, the seizure of multiple tons of narcotics, and billions in frozen assets. But the investigation exposed something far worse: systemic corruption within American institutions. Over 440 individuals across government, education, healthcare, and transportation had ties to the cartel. More than 380 law enforcement officials were flagged, and over 180 were arrested. For communities across the nation, the revelations created a profound crisis of trust. Police departments, courts, and local governments struggled to restore stability, yet Operation Hawthorne served as a national warning and a call to vigilance. America's true strength lies not only in its security forces, but in the transparency and integrity of its institutions.